We are back for part 3 of our tutorial of how to render elevations and sections using Photoshop. The technique that we're using is we're using layers. We are selecting areas and we are assigning materials and colors to those areas by using layer masks. In the first 2 parts of the tutorial, we focused on how we select areas and how we assign materials and textures to those areas. And for the remaining 2 parts, we're just going to look a little bit more at how we can refine our selections and how we can generate a coherent look, I suppose, is the best way to put it for our section. So we'll just pick it up more or less where we left off. We have been working on the interior of the living room space. We had moved some armchairs into position and we've been doing some shadows in those little niches where the television and the stove are. And now what we'll do is we'll just try to add some depth to the living room space by casting a shadow against the back wall and in the kitchen area as well. So we'll start this process off by creating a new layer. So I just hit the new layer button down here in the bottom right. My new layer is created. And what I want to do is I want to attach a mask that I already used when we were assigning the timber texture to the living room wall. I'm going to use that same mask again. It's going to help me this time to cast my shadow. So using Control Drag, I drag the mask that I want up to the new layer that I have created. Now I'm going to rename that layer. I'm going to call it Timber Wall Shadow because this is where my shadow is going to appear. Now remember that on these layers, when we're using layer masks, we have 2 little icons. One is the drawing, one is the mask. So making sure that I have the drawing icon selected on the layer because this is where I want to work. I'm going to go over to my color selector, press on it, and then choose a gray that will be suitable for the task. And this will more or less do it for me. I choose OK, and then I'm going to go up to my paintbrush tool, and up it comes. I have a brush which is a little bit too large, which we used when we were doing the sky in part 1. So I'm just going to reduce the size of the brush a little bit here, and then I'm just simply going to apply some of that grey colour. I'm going to paint it onto the back wall here to give a feeling of depth to the room. Now this isn't the only way that we can apply shadows. Personally, I prefer to do it a little bit more clinically. I prefer the shadow to have a precise line because I think it reads a little bit better. And I've used that technique in other tutorials, but today we'll just use the one that seems to be popular among students, which is to paint a graded shadow. Now I'm just going to take a quick moment to take all of those layers which are associated with that timber wall, that is to say the timber texture itself and the shade, and I'm going to group them just to make life a little bit easier for myself. And now I'm going to repeat the exact same procedure for the kitchen area. So we'll make a new layer and we'll copy over the layer mask that we used when we put in the original kitchen image. And then we're going to paint on some shade. This time we'll apply the shade a little bit more heavily because we want that kitchen to look like it's further off into the background. If this were a final presentation, of course, we'd be spending a bit of time on this to make sure that we get it right, and we'd be pretty careful about how we shade the area. But this very basic application will do us just for now. Now we're going to do a little trick using the adjustment layers, and we'll start it by using the polygonal lasso tool, which is up here in the top left corner. And if you follow me back down to the kitchen, you'll see what I'm doing here is I'm tracing this sort of conical shape. I'm going around the door, down onto the countertop in the kitchen and back up to the ceiling. Then I go down to the adjustment layer button and I choose exposure, and you'll see that this gives me some tools that I can play, some sliders I can play with on this brand new adjustment layer. And by moving around, you'll see that what I'm doing is I'm sort of creating a conical shaft of light as if there's a ceiling mounted light fixture directly over a work surface. So I'll rename that layer, and then I'm going to copy it because I'd like to have a second light in the kitchen. So when I make the copy, Control J, I just use the selection tool and I move that new layer over to the right. But as you can see, when I was drawing the first layer, I skirted around the door, so that cone of light has a funny shape. So rather than do it all over again, I'm just going to cheat. I'm going to use the selection tool and I'm just going to stretch it down so that that second cone looks a lot like the first cone and nobody's going to be any the wiser. And then we'll take all of those layers that are associated with the kitchen and we'll form them all into one group. And just so we can get a little bit of practice in using this technique to create the effect of a light, we'll do the exact same thing again, this time in the living room. So we just draw the shape with the polygonal lasso tool. Once we've done that, we choose the adjustment layer and exposure, and it's the same routine. We use the properties sliders to make our adjustments. To some degree, I suppose it's a matter of taste, provided all the time it gives the impression of a light fixture shining light onto a surface. And just as we did in the kitchen, I'll duplicate this shape, create another layer, Control J, and I'll move that layer over to the right so that now we have two light fixtures. And then I'll add them to the existing timber wall group. We really have most of the bits and pieces we need to make our section and elevation. And from here on in, well, with the exception of some landscaping, which we'll add, from here on in, it's really just a matter of finessing things here and there. So I'm going to start my finessing by casting a little bit of shadow on that lower roof from the upper roof. I'm just going to make the slate invisible for a moment while I create a new little layer mask. And when I've created that layer mask, I'm going to use it to paint some shadow onto the lower roof so that it makes it look like it's lower down and a few centimeters further away from us than the upper roof. In order for this new bit of shadow to be visible to us, I just have to make sure that the layer on which it appears is above the layer of the slate, otherwise I won't be able to see it. And now that I've done that, I think maybe I'll just touch it up a little bit more so it's slightly more visible. Then I'll rename that layer to something that I remember, and I'll bring that layer and also the slate layer below the red layer, the pattern layer. And now I'm going to make all of the layers that are associated with the roof into one group. So that will just free up some space on my layer stack, on my layer column. It doesn't mean that the layers are merged, it just means that they're all stacked in one place. But if I have to go back and make any changes, I can still edit each of those layers individually. Okay, so the extension through which we have cut the section is actually perpendicular to the main building behind. And it's coming out to meet us off the page, so in order to emphasize that, I'm going to have it cast a shadow on the building behind. And to do that, I will create another little layer mask, and then I will go through the usual routine of using my paintbrush to paint on some grey onto the wall behind. I'm not doing the most convincing job with my paintbrush here, but you'll have more time to refine this if you want to, but you get the idea. Now I'm just going to rename that layer and then move it down below the pattern layer. I think maybe it's time we addressed landscaping. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to create the effect of grass growing in front of the house. So to do that, what I've done is I've downloaded a clump of grass. I copied it from the internet. I pasted it into its own file. Within its own file, what I did was I removed the background just using the magic wand tool so that I was left just with the grass. And then I copied that across to my main drawing in the usual fashion. And I'll just close out that grass file to free up the clutter on my desk. Now, I don't really need to do this, but I'm going to create a clipping mask to help me with the next part just the same. First of all, I'm just going to rename the grass layer. Then I'm going to switch off all the other visible layers, with the exception of the red layer in the background and the grass layer, so that I can see what I'm doing. What I want to do is I want to make a layer mask to help me cut that grass. And I'm just going to do it slightly differently. So what I'll do is I'm going to select everything that is below the ground. I make that into a layer mask in the time-honored way. But obviously I don't want to make the mask with what I've selected. I want to make the mask with everything that I haven't selected. So there's a fast way of doing that is I just select the little mask icon and I hit Control I and it makes the inverse mask. Obviously, I didn't really need to do that, but I just wanted to demonstrate the Control I option for when you're making layer masks. Sometimes it can be fantastically useful. By hitting Control J on that grass layer a couple of times, I create some additional copies, which I can use to decorate the drawing a bit more. If there's some grass I want to get rid of, I just make sure I have the relevant grass layer selected, then choose the rectangle tool and hit delete. It's just important to make sure that the rectangle tool is working on the layer that you want it to work on. Otherwise, you won't get the result that you're looking for. And finally, on this part, I'm just going to select each of those grass layers and group them, call them grass, and I'll give them a color. And then I'll move that grass group above the pattern layer because remember, everything that is closer to us than the house should be above the red layer. It's the easiest way to remember how layers work. So now I'm just going to congratulate myself for successfully completing part 3 of the tutorial. So we'll come back in part 4 and what we'll do is we'll put in some trees and we also look at LUTs, lookup tables, which can be a handy way to finish off a drawing or to finesse a drawing if you don't have a whole lot of time. Okay, so we'll take a break and I'll see you back here for the fourth and final part.